I
I
just
love
haven't
it.
had enough coffee to use my brain yet today. Little tired after yesterday's flooring extravaganza, but we're almost done.
I love that. Coffee's going to be my top of mind too. So, hello and welcome to Public Access America. My name is Kid Rock. No, of course it's Jason. I just love that song. His name is Jeffrey, but we can call him all sorts of things. He doesn't seem to mind. Yeah, I quit coffee. Like yesterday I was like this is what's hurting.
Hmm?
Like 4 cups of coffee a day. So I stopped and like today I feel really, really, really good. And I think that's unique to my case, not to everybody's case, but a happier Jason is always a nice thing to have, you know?
Well, and for me, like I grew up with the whole just swilling coffee all morning until,
Yeah.
you were done. And I actually noticed that I was in a lot of pain too. So I went from drinking essentially what was a half a pot of coffee in one shot to
Hmm.
I will drink 1 cup of coffee in the mornings when I go to work, and then sometimes on the weekends I'll have 2 cups. So like this morning's a
Yeah.
2 cup sort of morning.
I believe it. Yeah. And you're still young, you know what I mean? It's just
Certainly
pain,
don't feel that way.
pain like terraforms the soul, I like to say. And then so it's nice to like find something out. I told my friend, I was like, I would love to go to the hospital and go on a conveyor belt and run through it until they fixed me, but I can't afford that. You know what I mean? I
Wait,
have
why
to
do I
come
keep
up,
getting the anal probe?
or yeah, I have had more probes in my genitals and rectum than any man should have, you know? And it was always
I
different
understand
answers.
that.
And if anybody just said, dude, 8 cups of coffee? No, you know, you drink some
Right.
water in there, maybe, yeah. So I've been telling doctors for the past 5 years, I want a nutritionist. Like, it's not you. You need to treat me once I'm baseline, but I'm never going to be baseline if there's nobody telling me
What's
what
the
I'm.
baseline?
Yeah, what's wrong? Like my baseline was eating salad for 8 months. Now I know that was wrong because it was coffee. I wasted a lot of time, but a nutritionist might have said, "All right, well, you're heavy on the coffee, you're low on the fiber. Switch those, you know?"
Right. And for me, it's like kind of trying to figure out what that balance is.
Yeah.
Uh, I probably haven't had the greatest eating habits as of late, but it's and what I mean by that is that I changed up my breakfast routine a little bit, but
Hmm.
uh, I'm still like holding steady slash losing a little bit of weight, so it's not like it's. I mean, I definitely need to do better, but it's also kind of one of those
Yeah.
things where it's like I have also been happy-ish,
Yeah.
with my food choice
Right.
because I feel good in the morning. Like I don't feel weighed down. I don't feel like I'm sluggish. But at the same time too, it's like, yeah, I probably should not just do what I'm currently doing. But
I don't know. If you want to feel sluggish, do it. And if it seems like a chore, then, you gotta balance that, the
yep.
joy with the hate, you know what I mean? And the other thing is all of those foods are turned into chemicals that
Hmm.
run our body, right? And so
Yep.
for you, your chemical balance is different than my chemical balance. And
Right.
so when we discuss these things, I think it's interesting because I always keep an individual perspective because I wonder if there's others out there like that. But even the others that are suffering from coffee like I was or am or whatever, they suffer in different ways and they need different
Well, I mean,
nutrition chemicals
let's
too.
think about this from a historical objective. You, like especially out here, where we have a lot of Native American tribes,
Hmm.
whose diet, really depended on fish a lot of the time.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of question in the Native American community about whether or not the lack of fish in the diet has been hurting them. I mean, if you've got tribes that have been living here for 10,000 years, it's real hard to sit down and say, well, no, they've evolved really quickly to not have that as a part of their diet. Nobody evolves
Right.
that really quickly. And I mean, you look at all the different types of people out there, you've got hunter gatherers, you've got agriculturalists, you've got, foragers, nomadic groups.
Yeah.
You've got, groups that have, depended on food from the sea. You've got groups that have depended on bison. You've got groups that have depended upon grains.
Yeah.
It's the idea that to me, the idea that homogeneously, we all just need one simple set of things just doesn't necessarily make sense. Now, you
Right.
get into, what is now the globalized economy, and, for, you know, tens of thousands of years, you had people who were pretty well homogenous. They didn't, really mix with other cultures,
Mm-hmm.
other essential tribes outside of their own. And
Right.
now that you have that mix, you have that question. I do think of, you know, as we've seen in more recent years, this whole craze of only eating meat or only eating vegetables or only
Only.
eating, yeah,
Right.
and it's like, it to me, it's one of those things where the nutritional needs of every person is so varied as it is.
So varied. Yes.
So who's to say that, somebody who, doesn't have, uh, one set of, DNA lineage doesn't need
Mm-hmm.
more fish, or one set of, it's like we all know those people that, have, they always have had certain things or always done certain things, and they feel better doing those things. And so
Yeah.
for me, it's just kind of that general question of, who are we really,
That's a
and
good point. Yeah.
and genetically it's hard to answer that question, and I think that's been like one of the weird things about, the do it yourself DNA kits, figuring out where you come
Yeah.
from, like excusing all of the privacy, issues for a moment,
Mm-hmm.
trying to figure out, who am I, genetically, who am I, where did I come from? There is the grand question of, do people that come from the British Isles have a certain set of dietary needs? Do people who come from, the more Germanic tribes have a certain set of dietary needs? What about the Mediterranean? What about Turkish? What about,
Yeah.
people who come from the Middle East? What about people who come from the heart of Africa? It's just it's a really interesting idea to me, but at the same time too, it's also one that I can see any number of bad actors deciding to take that information and, how try to, pose eugenics 2.0.
Yeah. I'm thinking about like the Bahamas because that's where the sugar cane is, right? Like a lot of people just didn't have sugar like that in their lives. I can't imagine another place that grows sugar cane to where like
Right.
pre-Europeans would have been ingesting a lot of sugar. And then I see why it was really popular, but I'm wondering, like, yeah, you're right. If we could figure out, I'm sitting here figuring like my dad was Italian, my grandma was French, like going through all these things, and yeah, I feel better eating meat. You know what I mean?
Well, and you look at even just like some of the interesting anecdotes. So, for example, a couple of weeks ago, Debbie and I took a walk with Billy, and I was, being somebody who's, always interested in plants, like native wild growth, I saw, one plant and I'm like, it looks like blackberry, but I bet that's salmonberry. And so I start looking at it, and sure
Ooh,
enough, it's salmonberry. And so, like, I start looking to see, why do they call it salmonberry? Because, I guess, the berry flesh does look like, if you peel open a salmon, it does have that like orange, color to the
right.
meat.
Okay.
Well, apparently, salmonberry, they actually, the Quileute tribe out here actually used to use the leaves of salmonberry to wrap their fish when they cooked it
Mm,
to give it an enhanced flavor. And I was like, huh, neat,
I like
interesting.
that. The
So
Mediterranean does that with grape leaves, and I love that.
exactly, exactly. And so there's, you have all of these different questions about how, different foods impact the body.
Mm-hmm.
Why, like at a fundamental level, we all know it's like, hey, raw sugars from, raw fruits and vegetables process better than, processed sugars because they're more
Right.
complex. But then when you look at it, it's like, well, why, all of these different ways that they used to cook different things, the question is what's been lost over time? And so for me, like reading how, one tribe out here used the leaves of salmonberry in order to, cook their fish
Mm.
was really interesting to me, because
Yeah.
apparently it adds an enhanced flavor profile to the fish. And
It
it's like,
isn't about the berry at all. There was
right,
a study that said like they compared I can't remember I read this about 10 years ago, but people they 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 used to hunt and expel energy to hunt. And so when they learned to cook their meat and learned to store their meat and learned to get grains and have food supplies readily at hand, they didn't use the energy hunting. So their brains developed more than, say, a gorilla who still just basically hunts all day for sustainment and food and uses that energy for body, not mind. And so I think a lot of what we miss is like the preparation, the task, the energy it takes to get the food because it's so easy,
There's
it's two
there's
two
actually two
clicks
parts to
away.
that. There's actually two parts to that. One and another part even goes even more primitive than that, and that is the fact that one of the things about one of the things our primitive ancestors figured out was is that eating raw meats took a lot of energy.
Right.
However, when they cooked that meat, it actually took less energy to digest that
Right.
that food, and so that allowed the body to use that energy to improve different functions of the body, like the brain.
Yeah. And when your
And
immune
so
system isn't trying to attack you because you're eating raw meat, then you can you feel healthier and better.
right, and so that's where it's always really interesting is like, you know, we've as humans have evolved because of different advantages that we've been presented over the years, like
Mm-hmm.
the ability to cook our food, the ability to grow our own, fruits and vegetables and grains and all that, the ability to go from having to uh, chase animals in order to survive to being able to figure out how to pen them in and just raise them and cull them as needed.
Right.
Which then, of course, gets into, I think, one of the notes that you wanted to talk about, which is our food
Our
and
food,
what's
well,
in it.
yeah, but you just segued into both things. We support local farmers, right?
Hmm.
We
Absolutely.
support local farms. We support bringing the means of production for vegetables and fruit and even meat to inner city food deserts, right? And
Hmm.
so I think we have a rub. There's an account in Defense of Animals USA on Twitter, and they keep sending this stuff like the bullfighting. And
Hmm.
and like the chick calling, I think we're always going to land on the humane dignity in death and the purpose of the animal. A farmer raises its pig and there's a cost to that. And he doesn't he doesn't hurt the pig. He doesn't do anything like that. But then the pig has purpose and it lives and it's happy. But as it declines, yes, eventually the farmer's going to give it dignity in death and it's going to go on for a bigger purpose. And
I
I
will
think it
s- I will add this, not every farmer, of course, you know, practices that sort of dignity. I
right,
mean,
I'm
we
speaking not mass
the
production.
right. Well, I mean, even in mass production, surprisingly, there really is a lot of care. But there's always a point, there's always a tipping point, and realistically
Right.
speaking, I mean, any rational meat eater should be appalled if the animals are mistreated to a certain mistreated,
Right.
like whether there's beatings, whether their hooves are rotting, whether there's
Mm-hmm.
whether they're not being treated for open wounds and things like that. I mean,
Yeah.
they're you know there is a respect and care for animals that most ranchers, I will say, have,
Right.
because not because it's part, because growing up with life and death surrounding you constantly, you do have an element of compassion to you, but also too, like, if you don't take care of your animals, that's your food, that's your money,
Right.
and you know at best you lose one animal, at worst you might lose multiple and your reputation might go down the shitter.
Mm-hmm.
You could get charged for animal abuse. I mean, there are
Right.
some states out there that are, there's some very conservative states out there that are very aggressive about how people treat their animals, and I think that's important. It's just that unfortunately you have the question of what is humane in
Right.
the culling of animals, and you have a group of people who say culling them at all is inhumane.
Right. And then we
So,
should
and
just not
that's
eat them at all. But that leaves them
which,
no purpose, right? To me,
and
it
it
doesn't
leaves
leave
them
them
no
purpose.
purpose. It leaves them no natural predator. And what you end up having is then an overpopulation of the animal, and then disease runs rampant through the animals. And then they die a pretty gruesome and horrific death because, number one, they've relied on humanity to give them their, let's say uh,
Right.
their shots in order to keep them healthy, the treatments in order to keep them from, developing sores and any number of different things. Because, most people don't realize that flies really attack cattle really hard. And if you
Yeah.
don't treat their ears and if you don't treat them, it looks pretty fucking nasty and they can get some really bad infections.
Right. And I'm not
So,
talking about people that treat their animals like that. You know
no,
what
no,
I mean?
no, but I mean, even when you're doing your best to try and treat your animals, those flies can be pretty vicious,
Well, yeah,
and
because they
so
evolve too, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
But with cattle, if you leave them with no natural predator, you'll see the same thing that happens within like deer populations. A disease will start to run rampant, and then instead of
Mm-hmm.
having a herd that's contained and controlled and taken care of, now you just have a diseased pestilence that is running rampant through an area, and
Yeah.
that's, I would argue, even less humane than if you were to just actually take care of the population, cull as you need to, and I would say
Mm-hmm.
work that system a lot more uh, extensively, scientifically, humanely.
Yeah.
and,
And
and
knowing the process, you know what I mean?
and that's just it. And nobody, I won't say nobody. There have been far too many people who don't understand that raising these animals is a lot of work. And even for farmers and ranchers, when you have to cull an animal, there's still an emotional element to it
Of
because
course.
this is something that you invest your time and money into, but there's also a thankful element to it. Like for us, we'd have cows every year that, they just got too old. They're not calving
That's
anymore.
right. They've
And
timed out, just like
and
people do.
and so those are the ones that they get a nice happy end of life where they were free range essentially,
Yeah.
inside of a large barbed wire enclosure in eastern Montana. And then when it was time, we took them off to be butchered. That was just the way
Right.
that it was.
So, real quick, that's what the running of the bulls is. It's exactly what you described, right?
The
And I
running of the
think,
bulls is a really interesting thing because I've always had a problem with it.
really, I did
Yes.
too until I actually researched and, wrote that note that I sent you.
Hmm.
And I really did. I didn't understand it. But when you look at the tradition of it, it's
Yep.
kind of cool. And then when you follow it through to the end result, it has, to me, it has a happy ending because those bulls go on to feed the entire population of Spain in one way or another at other
Hmm.
festivals throughout the year, you know?
For me, the issue was always that number one, I'm going to leave humanity, like people jumping in front of a large animal,
Right.
because that's Darwin Award material for me. But number two, during the process, there's usually a few bulls that get injured, like they'll break legs,
Yeah.
they'll
Okay.
break their necks. To me, that's the part that I've always had a problem with because growing up on a ranch, like with my bulls, you know, when it was time to call them, I wasn't going to run them down the street and see if they, number one, hit anybody or number two,
Right.
fell and broke a leg.
Good
Like
point.
there was an, like I understand that it's tradition and I understand that, I mean, it's a very long, long, long tradition, if I remember
Yeah.
correctly.
Yeah. And most of these are 4 to 6 steer bulls.
Hmm.
So,
Yep.
but that is a point I didn't even consider. How interesting.
So, I mean, that's the problem that I've always had. It's, I think,
Not the
like
bullfight afterwards.
well, I mean, that's an interesting one too because for me, as a hunter, as a conservationist,
Yeah,
putting an animal down as quickly and humanely as possible is the ultimate goal. Like,
right.
you know at least with like say American rodeos, for example, there's never a goal of having the bull get killed or anything like that.
Right.
Shit happens, and you can talk about and make the argument about whether or not the whole thing is humane and whether it's animal exhibition. There's certainly an argument to be made about that, absolutely.
Okay.
But at least with American rodeo, the goal was never to have the animals get injured during the process. It
Right.
happens. Whereas, some of these traditions, absolutely, that's what you were after. Is that you wanted the bull to essentially, self unalive,
Okay.
and
Right. Tire
and
itself out till it gives up and presents itself to you to die.
or in some cases there would be they try to run them into certain walls so that way they'd break their neck and things like that. And
Wow.
that's there's always for me it's just that, like, I understand that taking an animal's life isn't for everybody,
Right.
but for those of us who've done it multiple times, it's about doing it as quickly as possible to keep the animals from suffering.
Okay. That's the dignity.
Exactly.
And going on to
And
feed other people is purpose. Like I
absolutely.
wrote down here, I can see the soul in an animal's eyes, but I also know from growing and learning that purpose is the meaning of life, even for animals. And so giving them dignity in life, dignity in death, and purpose throughout that,
Hmm.
I like that. And feeding community to me is a purpose that's well represented and that animal should be proud, you know?
And for me, like the bull, with the whole quote unquote bullfight, if it's as long as it's just like the showmanship of the matador, and the end
Right.
goal, in the ring is not, trying to get the animal to kill itself, or, taking pot shots at the animal with a sword in order to kill it.
Right.
I'm fine with the showmanship. I mean, I can't sit there and say, well, American rodeo, but Spanish bullfighting. Like, there's
Right, right, right.
like I can't do that, but the showmanship of it, absolutely. Like, I think the showmanship of it is absolutely beautiful. I think it's a fantastic tradition in that realm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but no,
For me, my
like,
concern is always going to be that if the goal is that the animal dies at the end,
mm-hmm,
then I want it to be done as quickly and humanely as possible. That goes for cattle in any part of the world, as well as
agreed,
as somebody who's a hunter. My goal is always that you know if an animal is to die, it needs to die quickly and humanely.
agreed. I put down six injured in bull run, but all bulls die. You know,
Right.
like yes, and that's what I have an issue with. It's what you just described, the sword at the end, the tiring the animal out so it gives up. You know,
Right.
like that to me is an animal in fear, not an animal. And the other thing is these bulls are they're driven to town to be sold for bullfights
Hmm.
or food, right? Right, or
Right.
other. They didn't say
Now,
what the other was, but somebody also said these steers are pretty crappy meat. It takes a long time to cook it. They cook it in red wine and then they put it in a stew for another day. So it's like 48-hour process, you know?
which that I mean, that's probably just how the Bulls are raised. Now, here's
Maybe,
where
but I
here's where
mean,
this gets interesting. Now, most likely, without having looked anything up, if I were to just kind of take a guess, the Matador tradition probably comes from the fact that, number one, when bullfighting was probably first done, they didn't have the kind of mechanisms that we do now for quickly and humanely putting down an
right.
animal. So getting the bull to be tired so that way they could deliver, a one-shot kill was
That's a good
probably the
point.
element.
Yeah. You go in the wild and you get somebody to distract them like a rodeo clown or a matador with a cape. Yeah. Yeah. I
That
could
that
see
there's I
cavemen
could
doing
see
something
where,
like that.
well, not even cavemen. I can think of something like this, 500-600 years ago being
Mhm.
absolutely, because firearms weren't exactly common in those days.
Right. But I mean,
So
Stonehenge was built to funnel animals to a point to where the people could get them, you know? So it was all about directing the animals, tiring the animals out and that kind of stuff. But you're right. Now that we
I could,
have
s-
better
I could, s-
methods, like the chick calling, right? What did they
Mhm.
do before they had grinders to these chicks? So, yeah, these are all good points.
I mean, so it's kind of one of those things where, like any number of things, I'm not going to say that it was wrong, because probably for the time when these traditions had first developed, it was actually probably the best method that they had, and then it just got turned into like a huge festival, like a huge
Right.
gathering,
Because
for the
more people
population.
wanted to see it and eat.
And exactly, and you probably had kings and rulers that would put on these magnificent displays in order to show their wealth, their prowess, whatever.
And to feed the people. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's hard, it's hard to sit down and say that the tradition itself
Mm-hmm.
was bad from the beginning, because to be perfectly honest, it might actually have been the best method that they had for the time, and it's something that's
Right.
continued on. So it's always one of those, it's like, on one hand, on the other hand, and there's this constant balancing act of, why a person or why a group does something that they do. And there was probably at one point a very a very valid reason to do
Yeah.
what they did, and it was probably because it was the best method that they had at the time.
But now it's just become unevolved.
It yeah it had it isn't, I would say, like if we were to apply a certain standard of humanity or humaneness
Right.
to the process, 600 years ago it was probably the most humane method that there was.
Now.
Under today's methods and under today's availabilities, probably not.
But my little point in here about the steer, the bull being tough meat is it this seems like a lot of work for food that's barely edible, you know?
You have to think about it this way: cows, bulls have not always been the size that they have been.
Right.
The meat was probably not as good as you wanted it to be, but when you didn't have access to it, hell, any meat was better than
Any
zero.
meat was better than that. And but what I'm saying is now being evolved, would you I mean it seems like a lot of work for just meat that's not very good.
Well, I mean, well, this is where I'm always going to kind of like play the advocate here, the devil's
Hmm?
advocate. Who says it's not very good? There are probably people who think that it's one of the finest delicacies that you can eat.
Yeah, in Spain only one guy distributes it and he is so rich and so happy about that.
So,
He treats it right so that it comes out good because you can do that with any meat. It just seems weird like around here we don't I don't know. It seems like a waste
it's
of time.
well, I mean,
Let those bulls live and maybe bring in some better steer like,
I
and
mean,
walk them through and then do the show. I don't know.
well, and here's the thing, like for me, it's one of those things, like, we like the way that I when I did more hunting, cured animals was it was a process to cure them. And
Yeah, yeah.
you can make the same argument that deer meat, elk meat,
Mm.
antelope,
I'm
or
just kind of searching for a
pronghorn.
solution, you know?
I think the solution, there really isn't a solution in this case, and that's the real answer. Like, if unless you go with a very specific, if the solution is about food, then yeah, maybe a better source of food. If the solution is about dealing with animals humanely,
Yeah, yeah.
there's probably a different solution. If the solution is about honoring tradition, yeah, there's probably a continued slash better solution. There's just not a great solution that involves all of these.
There is a clause in the bullfighting to where the audience can pardon the bull, and I think that's cool. Like I think they could have the bullfight, tire the bull out, and then put the bull out to pasture, to live its life that way, and then have meat like at the festival. Just have a festival, you know what I mean? Like we have county fairs all the time, but we don't watch them kill the animals, right? We don't like watch the animals run around and then eat them, right?
Well, it depends on your county fair.
Yeah, I guess so. I've never been to a county fair like I've had pig at a county fair where I watched a pig race, but that doesn't mean they were the same pigs that
Right.
fresh. You know what I
No,
mean?
and I think that's one of those things that really, really, really depends.
Yeah.
Some places, and of course this is the ones where a certain group of people hammer on this. They're really understanding and attached to the way that animals are raised, animals are
Yeah.
culled, animals are cooked and served. It's just that's been part of agricultural life for
Hmm.
millennia.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Well, I don't have a problem with the meat eating, and I don't care what you're eating, like we talked about. It's just,
Right.
it seems like, but the running part is the issue because that's where the chances are they'll get hurt the most in an
Hmm.
inhumane way. Yeah. But it
That's
did start with like ranchers like getting their bulls excited so they could get them to town. Like, how
right.
you drive steer. And then stupid kids in the region would be running in front of the bulls because they literally had nothing else to do. And so now in 2020, they haven't done this in 3 years, by the way. They just brought it back after the pandemic. They could have just let this like slowly fade, you know?
But that's, I mean, but then you have the greater question of national tradition.
Yeah, I
Letting
guess.
whether or not you let national tradition fade. As a country that's only 250 years old, it's hard for us to sit down and say that some country or some culture that's had a tradition for five,
Mm-hmm.
6, 7,000 years, whatever,
Right.
let let something that they've been doing for that long just go by the wayside.
Okay.
It's
Uh, I'll just
it's
call it
it's
cringe then.
I mean, that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think.
We have traditions we've evolved from, we have more than one gender now. And so we've evolved past calling people just he or just she. There's a new I don't even want to talk about that. There's something more important to talk about than that. Um, Jeffrey, turns out that I think I have weed killer in my urine and I don't know why.
And you remember how I've talked about this before, about how
Yeah, yeah,
Cheerios
yeah.
is one of the largest places where you find glyphosate?
Yep. Yeah, you said it about 3 times last week, and then I went to Twitter and I went to the news, and there was something that said 80% of all people, and I clicked on that, and the first one was 80% of all Americans have glyphosate in their urine, and so like but first, they did a study with like 2,500 people that was supposed to represent all of America. Do you know, because you're a data guy, you're an agriculturist, and you know all about this. So you're kind of like a guest on this. You're a guest
Hmm.
expert on this. I
Hmm.
want to know because how did they get the poll? Like, how did they decide? How can this represent 80% of people when it's 2,500 people?
So, oh, sampling is a fun
Yeah, but can we trust it? That's all I'm saying.
one. Would I trust it? I personally would prefer more data. Um,
Right.
just because without knowing where the samples come from,
Hmm.
like that's always my biggest problem.
And they're going forward with that. They're funding that. They're working on
I
that.
mean, there's always that question of there's always the question of what does this question warrant further study.
Right.
Now, as a data person, you kind of have to understand that there's always a starting point, and that starting point is usually a lot smaller than you want it to be. Because I mean, realistically, it's like, do you want to go ask for a million vials of pee? No, you really don't.
Right.
Especially if if you start sampling and you don't find anything.
So we're gonna have to eventually in a year or two be like 23andP.com.
Oh God, just
Sorry.
I feel sorry for the post office. Another vial of piss, another vial of piss.
Right.
But but that's the thing though, is that a lot of these places, there's certain collection places, there's certain testing places where people
Okay.
will go in. They'll provide the sample, then that sample gets that sample will be medically collected by a research facility, and then it gets sent on to wherever else, or they'll test it right there and they'll send the results on to.
Right.
Um, so
Or you go to your doctor and they just add it to the list of things that's tested for.
so that's always one of the things that's really
Okay.
interesting about some of these tests and the way that they perform
So
them.
is this even
So
worth paying attention to then? Glyphosate, what
absolutely,
is it? What is it?
glyphosate.
Yeah,
So
glyphosate.
glyphosate.
Sorry.
So glyphosate is the active ingredient in a chemical called Roundup. Roundup,
Mm,
if you're familiar with it, is known to kill anything that's green.
right. Everybody
Essentially,
knows
is
what Roundup is, unless you're in the inner city.
now here's one of the fun things that most people don't
No, it's there
realize.
too. What?
So To give you a little bit of history on something that I actually wrote a research paper on
Yes.
back in high school.
Yes.
And so my research paper is 20 years old on this. Um, so one of the things about the time, about Roundup Ready stuff, everybody, freaked out about about the whole idea that a plant being Roundup Ready isn't natural. Number one, that's actually not correct. How we found out about it is actually far more sinister than most people realize. So how did we find out what Roundup Ready was? So Roundup we knew killed everything that was green. It was a great weed killer. It was a great uh, way to take fields and make sure that they were barren and free of weeds before you did your planting. It was a great
Why?
post-emergent.
Why?
So why? So
Yeah, I'm sorry. The whole thing is where do we, it's not the whole thing, but where do weeds come from and why do we even need to get rid of them?
so when it comes down to like the grains that you eat, when you're harvesting your crops, there are a lot of materials that end up getting taken up into your combine.
Right, right.
Some of those things are, they're weeds. They are a non-desired plant. They either have no nutritional value, they spread really easy.
Hmm.
They're annual plants that take over they take over places that are fallow and barren, and they're not exactly what you want to have in your crop. And when a farmer goes to sell their crop, depending on how much um, extra material there is in the crop, they actually get docked pay wise on all of that extra material,
Okay.
because that all has to be sorted out, that all has to be cleaned out before it can go on to like whether it's your chemical processing in order for that to become next year's seed crop, or even to become your cereal grains for the food that you're going to eat. You can't
Okay.
just have thistle showing up in your food, unfortunately.
Right, right. That's a good point. That's what I wanted to,
So
yeah.
so all that to go back to the way that farmers looked to control this was through spraying their summer fallow. So what that did was that kept all of these plants that came up from going to seed, and so you
Right,
wouldn't have you wouldn't have that material showing up in your crop next year,
right.
or that year, depending on when you spray.
You spray before
But
you seed.
if you sprayed before you seeded, that would help reduce the amount of potential weeds you'd have.
Right, right.
Problem is that as ground gets tilled, weeds like to take over areas that have been disturbed. So every time you turn the
Hmm.
soil, it gives you a new place for seeds to potentially settle in and grow. But
Gotcha.
also, any seed material that is in there, a lot of seeds can stay dormant for up to like 10 years.
Wow.
So you might have weeds that were already in the soil that, thanks to you turning it, now have a better chance of actually germinating.
Okay.
Now, Roundup Ready. This is where this gets fun. Everybody thinks that Roundup Ready just magically appeared and that somehow we started spraying our crops with all this stuff. Well, that's actually not the case. So the company that created Roundup actually,
Monsanto's.
Monsanto, they actually discovered that there was a plant that did not react to glyphosate, not because they were out doing a bunch of testing, but because they actually had a chemical leak in one of their waterways,
Right.
and this plant didn't die from exposure to glyphosate. So now, instead of being alarmed, they went, holy shit, what if we could take whatever this is and put this into crops, so that way you could spray this when the crops came out, and that would get farmers the ability to get rid of all of the weeds but keep
All the
all of
time.
the crop. And I mean, when you think about it, it's actually a very brilliant idea.
Hmm.
Farmers would no longer have to worry as much about whether or not they're going to have secondary material in their crops. And
Right.
it's fantastic. It's exciting. So here's
And
then comes the
results
next,
of production are they prove themselves, right? Better
right.
fruit, bigger fruit, lasts longer, it tastes better,
You
it
don't have
looks better.
it's not even about any of that. It's about the fact that number one, your crops are not competing with
Right.
other plants, number one. And number two, it's about the fact that now your profit margin isn't going to be affected by,
Yeah,
all these other conditions. So
exactly.
so then you end up with this. Now you end up with the question. Now this is like, I want to say late 80s, early 90s.
Mm,
How do you take this thing that we found and make this other thing? Now, there's two ways that you can make this happen. There is natural selection, which is you plant a bunch of seeds, you spray the field, and if it comes up and doesn't die, you have now this little group of seeds that is potentially, free of, it's
resistant.
resistant to Roundup.
Right.
And you have to sit there and do that over and over and over and over and over and over until you actually get enough of a seed crop in order to do that.
Right.
Or you can find out what is the gene that makes the plant Roundup ready in this one, but not in this one, and then basically take over that natural selection and make that happen a lot faster.
Right.
And that's what science looks to do, is
Where it can.
it takes genes from one plant, splices them into another plant in order to elicit a similar response.
And we did that with plant splicing before we did genetic splicing. Like
Oh,
we've always
absolutely.
been evolving our crops. So
We've always done
this
that.
was a jump in the evolution though.
It was essentially like, it was a shortcut. It was a
Right.
wormhole, essentially, if you want to think about it that way. It was warp drive. It
Right.
you know it
Right.
took something that existed naturally in another plant, and what scientists theorized would eventually be available in this plant, but just made the process happen a lot faster.
Right.
So, cut to now you have different Roundup Ready crops. I think Roundup Ready oats was the first crop, if I remember correctly,
Mm.
uh, to actually be Roundup Ready. Because one of the things that you end up with in oats is wild oats, and oats and wild oats are not the same. Um, they are not nearly as pleasant. They have sharp little barbs in them. It's a pain in the ass.
Okay.
But getting rid of those wild oats was actually a huge benefit for farmers. Now, imagine if you could take that and put that into a bunch of different crops. It's really exciting. Durum, spring
I
wheat, winter
love
wheat,
Durham.
oats. You could do this to canola. You could do this to flax. You could do this to chickpeas or
Corn,
garbanzo
right?
beans. Corn. You could do this to any number. Soybeans. You could do this to any number of crops out
Right.
there. But one of the things that I postulated in my paper, and it was a concern at the time, was the thing about natural selection is that the more that you use something, the more likely a plant is to evolve a protection to it.
Okay.
And so my question that I postulated at the time was, are we going to see the rise of Roundup resistant weeds? And the answer is absolutely, you could. You absolutely could. And because, like anything else, if you spray enough times,
Mm-hmm.
eventually there's going to be one time where something has reproduced and the seed is going to come out and it's going to be Roundup ready.
Well,
And
yeah,
you're
because
going to end up,
there was that
that's
one the initial plant that was Roundup ready, right? And so a weed
exactly,
could happen with a weed too, right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
It's evolution. The
Mm,
idea that plants don't evolve the same way. Plants actually evolve a lot faster simply because they have many generations within time that we have one generation.
right.
So the idea that this couldn't happen was, a big problem. Now here's the thing, like anything else, if you use something to label, it should minimize the effects of what you're using. However, as humans go, well, if a little is good, a lot is better, right?
Yeah, that's the way we generally do it.
So you run into this problem of, are we using the appropriate amount of chemicals on our crops? Now, one of the things that we have found particularly problematic, especially over the last 60, 70 years, is you end up seeing a lot of these chemicals end up in waterways. For
That's
example,
where it's coming from. Okay.
so for example, the more chemical that you use, and depending on the timing of using it,
The
the
more
more likely you
runoff.
are to have runoff. The Salton Sea, for example, is a great example of this. So
Hmm.
the Salton Sea didn't have a natural outlet, so the water would just pool up in there and pool up in there, but it didn't actually refresh. It didn't go anywhere.
Right.
So when farmers during that time were spraying all these chemicals around during the 60s, it wasn't a big deal because there were fish in there, people were boating in there. It was like this great destination that everybody wanted to go to. But 20, 30 years of agricultural runoff poisoned the water and it started killing the fish. The place started to become very alkaline. It smelled really bad, and suddenly it was no longer a destination place because you weren't having water refresh. They
Right.
closed off the source of where the water was coming from, and all of that runoff contributed to just essentially nuking the fish population, which of course then turned this into a horrible smell. Then you have the grand question of, do I want my kids bathing in the chemicals of the Salton Sea? And the answer was an overwhelming no.
No. Right.
So
But that's how we
if
also get E. coli in our lettuce, right? Like because of the runoff, the infected runoff that actually goes into other areas.
No,
No?
E. coli is more of an issue of fecal matter.
Right. Yeah, but I heard it was from livestock runoff that went into
livestock
the
runoff is different
agriculture.
than Livestock runoff is different than chemical runoff it's a different
Yeah,
agricultural
yeah, I'm
runoff,
sorry.
yes.
Okay.
In different agricultural runoff, but yes.
Okay. I didn't want to take us too
So
far off, so I'll just yeah, you're right.
so so all that to say, if you have that much runoff
Hmm.
from using different chemicals, the question then begs, if you're in places that don't experience a lot of runoff, or it's getting into your water table, then what are the chances are that the plant is actually intaking that into its seed, depending on when you spray?
Okay.
So one of the things that uh, I had postulated at the time was, we had no idea how much of it was going to turn up in our food, and we didn't know what that would look like.
Right.
Now, obviously, if you have glyphosate if you have just a bottle of Roundup, you don't drink the bottle of Roundup. That'll kill you.
Right.
But if you dilute it down, could you drink it? Yeah, it's just not going to be good for you. So,
Well, in what way? And is Roundup just straight glyphosate or is it other?
no, I mean, there's inert chemicals in there as
Okay,
well,
yeah, I'm just curious. Okay.
but the active ingredient is glyphosate.
But that's what, yeah, if you pour a bottle of Roundup into a 5-gallon bottle of water, you might be able to drink it, but you're not going to feel good. And there's short and long-term consequences to that. But yeah, how does it get into the food? How does it get into my does it
Now,
get into my tomatoes? Does it get into my cucumbers, you know?
now that's the grand question. So, any crop that is Roundup ready is going to have probably the potential to have it absorb into the food. Now, here's where this gets fun, because now we get to go back into the genetics. Are there genetics that inhibit the uptake of glyphosate? Maybe. I honestly
From the
don't know.
root, right? That's what I'm
Exactly.
that's where
From
my
the
mind
root,
just was.
from the root, or from the berry. Because
Right.
remember, wheat wheat is a seed. It's berry, the berry of the grass.
Yeah, it is.
So it's an interesting concept. Um,
I love my bread with wheat berries in it. Oh my
so so one of the things that we have to consider and take into account in this is that at different stages of seed development, your plant is uptaking a lot of water because it's
God.
trying to plump up that berry. Now, depending on when you spray, you're going to end up with, a high level of water intake. And if you're spraying a ton of chemical on your crop, there is a really good chance that, number one, it's going to get down to the soil, it's going to get into the soil, and that root is going to take it up. Now, you run into many numbers of questions here, and unfortunately, this is a place where I'm not necessarily going to have all the answers.
Okay.
Over time, chemicals break down. that's very much the case. Glyphosate is it's supposed to be inert inside of 48 hours.
Wow. Okay.
So that's one of the bonuses of glyphosate, because when you look at any number of different chemicals that you can spray, the half-life of the chemical can actually be very long. For example, Tordon can have a very long half-life, especially if you don't use it according to label.
Right.
The reason I know this is because my stepfather decided that he wanted to try and spray our little garden for weeds, before we planted, but he fucking hosed the shit out of it with Tordon, and nothing grew in that spot for 10 years.
Wow. And that's
After
the
I want to say it was
evolution of weed killers right there.
and I want to say that after and I don't even know that that necessarily counts as the evolution so much as this is what happens if you don't use it according to
But I
label.
mean shortening the life, right? The
Right,
half-life. That and making a pesticide that is more controlled than is always there. That's what
right.
they've always been working
I
towards,
will
I
say
hope.
though that my mom and I still joke about the fact that after like 3 or 4 years we tried to plant some crops down where our little garden was, and the only thing that came up was corn, and it was purple and twisted like something out of a fucking horror movie. It was really weird.
Wow.
So, but that was the biggest question. If farmers aren't using your product according to label, then what's happening to the crop itself?
Hmm.
Now, you always run into that question of, are farmers using more because they're not reading the label, or are they using more because the weeds that they're trying to treat are becoming resistant?
Right. Or do they just not know enough and they think more is better?
That's not so. Here's the problem: is that for farmers, um, I believe in every state you have to get what is called a commercial or an agricultural applicators license. You actually have to go and you have to test, and you have to show that, number one, you can read the fucking label.
Right.
So that's one of the biggest problems is that you know the company itself says this is what we have determined the safe limits to be. Are those the safe limits? That's a whole different question.
Mm-hmm.
But the company can't control whether or not you are actually using the product
Yeah.
according to
User applications may vary.
exactly. So, for example, you might get enough chemical to treat, let's say, 1,000 acres, but you don't have 1,000 acres that needs to be treated. Maybe just
Right.
have 100. So instead of using that amount that's for 1,000 acres on 1,000 acres, you're using the amount on 1,000 acres on just 100 acres, and you're just essentially nuking that spot.
Exactly. Because you don't know
So
better. Or you just think more is
you
better.
do know better. You're just like, well, fuck it. If a little's good, a lot is better. You run into what
Yeah,
we call
right, right.
we call it the farmer's dilemma. If the price is bad, you grow more crop. But if the price is good, you grow more crop. So anything that affects your ability to grow crop, you want to
Right.
handle as quickly as possible.
Okay.
So that then leads into this whole question of what happens when you apply way too much chemical over an area and it gets into your food.
Yeah.
Now, there is, I think, the $1 million question, because this is one of those things where I don't know that we know enough at this point. There is a lot to say that are people getting sick from Roundup? Absolutely. I do believe that because it's a chemical. And if you're not
Well,
wearing the proper protective gear when you're applying it or
okay.
using it, because the thing is that Roundup isn't just
Ah,
available on a commercial schedule. You can also buy it at fucking Walmart to use it in your own
okay.
yard.
Well, so
And
users may absorb it.
absolutely. It's a chemical, it's a
Yeah.
spray. If you get it on your skin, it's gonna get in you. That's just the way that
Yes.
any chemical works.
That's the truth.
Now, I'm going to preface this by a little story that actually happened to me. My grandmother's ex-husband was a farmer, and he used to play a fun game with the kids, with the boys, anyways, called "Ride on the outside of the spray coop and let me know when the weeds are coming so I can turn up the spray." I didn't have any fucking PPE on. I didn't have any masks or
Right.
anything. And when I came back home from a summer of literally, spending part of my days riding on the spray coop, I was a fucking mess. I was wheezing. I was sick. And there's also honestly a lot of questions about whether or not like my lung problems developed because I was literally riding on the outside of a fucking spray coop
Mm-hmm.
being exposed to chemicals
Yeah, I got you. My
because I was
uncle
getting
used to
that
have
shit.
my uncle
Mm,
used to have me clean concrete floors with sulfuric acid with no protection at all, you know?
right. And I mean, under, if, and I guarantee you that if you looked at what the recommended PPE is for dealing with Roundup, it probably isn't fucking nothing. So
Right.
once again, you have this issue of the company might have laid out exactly what the expectations were for you to use their product, that you need to wear goggles, that you need to wear a
Mm-hmm.
mask, that you need to wear protective clothing, that you need to wear, I mean, there's even chemicals out there where they flat out tell you that if you're when you're mixing the chemical, you need to be wearing a respirator. And there
Yeah,
were chemicals that, working on the
you
farm that
should be anyway.
which right. So there were chemicals that I worked with on the farm where we had
Mm-hmm.
respirators, and when it
Right.
was time to work with those chemicals, you put on your respirator. That said, this Roundup has become a chemical that has not just been commercially available for agriculture, but commercially available for anybody who owns a home.
Right.
You can literally go in and buy the mix at Walmart, go back and nuke your driveway, nuke your
Yeah.
garden.
Just hope
I
there's no
mean,
breeze that blows in, you know?
and so you run into this issue of, with all of these chemicals that have been available, if for residential use, you now have what I would call a system of cross contamination. You have the issue of, is the glyphosate in our food really the problem? Now, I say this because I don't have an answer without knowing whether or not it is an inert version. Because remember, glyphosate is supposed to be inert after 48 hours.
Yeah, that's what's been in my head since you said it. Like, what does it matter if there's a glyphosate in my pee if it's going to be inert in 48 hours?
That's the grand question. So if it's inert in 48 hours, is there actually a health problem with it in the food? The answer is I
Right.
don't know, and it
I,
does warrant further study.
I want to
It
say
needs more.
Monsanto and the people that bought Roundup and the EPA, they all say there is not a problem. It isn't a carcinogen, but there was a court case that said they got to look into it further.
And I absolutely would hope and expect that they do. But now, when you have glyphosate and it's not inert, and it's getting onto your skin and it's getting into
Right.
your lungs because you're out spraying in your yard, you're out
Yeah.
spraying in the field. There, I would honestly, really, actually, actively expect that there would be health problems associated with that. You're supposed to be wearing protective equipment, and dumbasses like myself have not done that in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Because we all go, oh well, if it's available over the counter, it should be safe, right?
Yeah.
Well, shit, how many poisons do we know that are quote unquote safe that we can buy over the counter that tell you don't fucking use this unless you're using X, Y, and Z?
Yeah.
Just because it's available over the counter doesn't mean it's necessarily safe.
Oh, I agree. I
So
agree.
so you run into that question of cross contamination, especially in a data realm, which is where I'm headed with this. The amount of people who would potentially just eat glyphosate, like this is where the science comes in. Does it surprise me that 80% of people might be exposed to glyphosate either through their food or through their own personal dealings? No, that number would seem very feasible to me. However, the question is of exposure. What is your exposure? And this is where we can actually test in a number of different ways, because there's going to be people who, let's say, they don't eat anything that has glyphosate in it. All they do is they eat, the most organic of the organic. No chemicals, no pesticides, no nothing. Okay, great. That can give us a potential baseline. You're going to have the people who are literally just eating what they buy at the grocery store, Cheerios, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're going to be the ones that just are only exposed to glyphosate in the food. And so you then run into this whole question of whether or not, that is the problem. Then you're going to have the people who may or may not be exposed to glyphosate in their food, but they're definitely going to be, exposed to glyphosate because they are using the chemical
Or in their water supply, I just want to
in their
add.
potentially in their water supply. Now, local water is supposed to be, local water systems
Mm-hmm.
are supposed to be testing what all is in there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
so the question really then becomes, is that, is there glyphosate in the water, or how they're looking at that. There's so many ways that you can test this cross contamination of glyphosate to figure out where is the actual threat.
Right.
And that is where things get really difficult. And so, from my perspective, there's still a lot of unknowns. And I'm not going to pretend to have the answers, and I'm not going to pretend to say that, oh no, it's fine in your food, but not, it's
Right.
fine in your
Right.
food as well. That I can't say that. I
It's
honestly can't.
something you should use.
As a
Yeah.
scientist, I'm very comfortable with saying things like that and saying I don't know. And the
Well,
answer is I
yeah.
don't know, because nobody's studied it yet, or there hasn't been enough studies on it yet. But I would argue that this particular study is going to lead us down that question of, is there actually a problem here? Yeah, sure, the
Right.
EPA, Monsanto, the company that bought it, I want to say it's Bayer now.
Bear. Bear. Yeah.
Um, they might all say that it's fine, and they might
Hmm.
all be right, but they might not be. And
Right.
and and the thing is that there just hasn't been enough studies done on it to find out, if it's a problem, where does the problem actually come from? Is it
Right.
coming from the food? Is it coming from the use of the chemical, either in agriculture or in residential? Is it both?
Or is it
And
your body? Is it just your body unable to deal with it? A
and
weaker body with a chemical in it is going to react differently than a fit body. A young body and an old body are going to react differently to a chemical in it repeatedly.
exactly.
If it's an inert in 4 hours, but you eat something that has it in it heavily every day, it's going to build up. It's going to be there and it's going to hurt you. I'm just tuning in because, hey, everybody, thank you for listening to Public Access America. Come back Thursday because we're not done with this conversation, but we have other stuff too. Love you. Bye. And we're back. All right, there we go.
So the question about what's in our food really
Mhm.
does play an important role, because the idea that you're going to get rid of chemicals and pesticides and herbicides and all of that stuff in order to
Right.
maintain a healthy crop is not feasible. But at the same time, there have been new methods developed in agriculture in order to reduce the reliance on those things.
Yeah.
So for
Good.
example, for example, like I told you about, when farmers would have to till their fields, it was a common practice to till your field. The idea is that by turning the soil, you were, taking what was left over from last year, burying it in the soil so that way it would break down
Right.
further, and you would end up having you'd end up having a better organic mix in your soil. Turns out that's not really the case. Turns out what that does is it leads to soil erosion. You end up having lower quality of soil. Different nutrients end up blowing away because
Oh,
of how arid the soil is. There's a
right.
number of problems with it. So by moving towards a no-till strategy, what they've found out is that, oh hey, because we're minimally disturbing the soil, weeds aren't necessarily taking root in some of these places.
That's cool.
Also, because you're not turning soil, you're having less issues with erosion. Because you're not turning the soil, you don't have all of these nutrients blowing away. Because you're not turning the soil, you have all of these benefits of not turning the
How
soil.
does that affect runoff?
Well, think about it this way. If you have loose soil,
Mm-hmm.
you have loose places that
Right.
allow water to flow.
Right.
Now, if it's not as loose, is there runoff? Absolutely possible.
Well,
It
of
all
course, it's just, is it negligible or not? I'm just
Well, the
thinking
runoff
there.
issues, the runoff issues are a question of a couple of things. Number one, it's where what is your soil's ability to have water leach through into your water
Yeah,
table.
yeah, yeah. Right.
Now, some places the water, like for example, the water table where I particularly lived, the water table was like 100 feet below. So the
Wow.
idea that you're going to get, the idea that you're going to get a ton of chemical runoff down into your water table, I mean, you're really going to have to like have a bunch of chemicals, and you're going to have a bunch of water, and it's going to take a lot of
Correct.
time to. So I
Right.
mean, it's not impossible, but it's improbable.
Right.
That said, into major waterways, I mean, there's always the possibility. Water doesn't stop flowing just because you stop turning the soil. It's just that if there is compounds in loose soil, that loose
Mhm.
soil is not being taken with when it runs because there is no loose soil when you switch to no-till methods.
Gotcha. Yeah. I just
So
thought
you have
loose soil would make more for more runoff. I don't know why I
absolutely.
thought that.
It absolutely would because a lot of those chemicals rest at the surface.
Right.
And so when that surface soil is getting washed away, it's getting washed into major waterways. That chemical is then moving into major waterways. So
Right.
by having less soil get turned over, you actually have a better chance at minimizing your runoff.
I like
And
that.
even from a farmer's perspective, because you're not just putting chemical spray on there to kill weeds, you're also putting fertilizers down in order to make sure that your crops have the nutrients that they need to grow. And you don't want that washing away because it's literally money running down the fucking gully.
Right.
So by adopting a lot of these methods and methodologies, you've ended up with a reduction in runoff, a reduction in erosion, an increase in crops, an increase in stability of your crops, increases
Yes.
in organic matters, decreases in weeds, which leads to the decrease in the number of pesticides and herbicides, or at least herbicides that you'll need to use.
I like
Pesticides
that.
can be a little bit of a mixed bag,
Mm.
but we have different methods of dealing with different pests. Unfortunately, grasshoppers are a pain in the ass, but at least in Montana, wheat stem sawfly, we just plant wheat with thicker stems rather than hollow stems. That's just how we deal with that, and it's a more natural selection process.
God, I love that.
So, chemicals, there are ways in which you can minimize the amount of runoff you get. All of this goes down to say that it used to be that farmers were very much well, fuck it, we'll just go with this and this will work. As crop science has really progressed and really caught on in a lot of areas, especially rural communities, what a lot of farmers have found out, that the minimal cost of doing soil studies by doing certain tests at your local chemical, and fertilizer depots,
Right.
you can actually target what you need a lot better. So instead of spending, let's say, $20,000 on a fertilizer bill, I'm not, I'm
Hmm.
just
Yeah, yeah.
throwing numbers out here, that you might only need to spend $5,000 on a fertilizer bill, and that extra $1,000 that you spend on having your soil tested, you're still coming out $14,000 ahead of what you used to do,
Right.
because you did soil sample testing. Or, if you're looking at, how you're mixing your chemicals and how effective it is, and what used to be a $50,000, herbicide bill might now only be $20,000 because you don't have to apply to the entire soil. You can literally selectively target. Now throw in GPS mapping uh, as
Right.
part of that. You can now map out certain areas that might have weeds in it. And so then when you go to treat your crops, instead of spraying the whole field, you can now target zones
Hmm.
instead. So there have been a lot of improvements in the science of raising food,
I would hope
but
so.
there are still, but like anything else, farmers typically don't have, you know, your small rural farmer typically doesn't have access to most of this technology. And
Right.
with farmers usually being a pretty aged group, most of them don't have the understanding to use the technology. And so it's the younger generations of farmers that have grown up with the internet and grown up with all
Hmm.
this different technology. They're the ones that are coming in to figure out how to use that to their advantage. Corporations like John Deere have also come in, and they're working on how to make this a much more feasible platform for farmers to use, anywhere from your young buck who knows exactly what they're doing to your aged, your elderly farmer who literally just wants to just jump in the tractor and go.
Right.
you
He
know
knows
you're
the almanac, that's for sure.
exactly. It's one of those things, kind of like what I said in the last show. The past is the past, and what we did in the past may not have necessarily been the best thing, but it was the best that we had for the time. And now,
Right.
with the advent of, with the real real good look at crop science, there's a lot that's changing, in agriculture that's moving us away from that, well, if a little is good, more is better.
That's good.
It just, like anything else, it takes time and it takes understanding, and
Yeah.
but it also takes people going, you know what, I'm going to mix it according to the way that this goes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I will say that not every farmer does that.
No, but more is better is also an expense, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily an expense that you want to have.
Right. No
But
farmer wants to spend more than they have to
right,
grow their crops.
right. And that's where the beauty of being able to target this has come in, especially
Right.
with GPS mapping, is now that they're looking at fields and they're not thinking, great, now I have to, spray this whole, this quarter section of
Mm-hmm.
land, the entire thing. They're going, oh cool, out of this quarter section, there's maybe about 20 acres here and 5 acres here that I have to spray.
Right. But
And so
even if the entire acre needs to be sprayed, they don't have to overdo it. There's a
exactly.
point where it works and then breaks down and works correctly, and then any more than that is kind of overkill, and you're just kind of it's like when you
You're
pump
wasting money.
when you
You're
fill your
wasting money.
tank, but then you keep like squeezing the handle to get one more penny. That's not actually giving you more gas. It's just going back into the pump. And it's the same thing. You don't want to use more because you don't want to spend more.
And that's and farmers are figuring that out.
Yeah.
It's just that with the new technology, it's actually become easier, because it used to be that, you either had to spray the whole field, or you had to try and target how you were spraying your field, but then you were also running the risk of, what if I'm actually not treating what I need to be treating?
Yeah.
So crop
Aw,
science, agricultural
farming is
science,
work.
farming is work. It's a lot of
Aw,
work. It's hard work.
right.
but but in the end, like as farmers figure out, as farmers switch to newer methodologies that, minimize soil disruption, that minimize the need for, treating, various weeds that try to set foot.
Yeah,
The fewer weeds you have to spray, the less likely you are to have to deal with super weeds that come up that are resistant to the chemical that you're putting down. And so,
right.
and the less chemical you have to put down, the less likely it is to get absorbed into your food, and the less likely it is that you're going to test for glyphosate in your pee.
Mm,
So,
right. But does that even matter? If glyphosate is in my pee and it's breaking down anyway, does it really matter? It's just such an interesting thing to pay attention to.
well, and that's where it's, that's one of those ones where we just have to do we'd have to do the science on it.
Uh-huh.
And so you run that. That's it's so to get back to where we were, is 2,500 a decent sample? It's a decent enough sample to say, hey, we need to look into this a little bit more
Right. Right.
and find out. You know, a lot of places they want like a 1% or a half percent. It just depends on how much. I mean, even at 1%, you're looking at 3 million samples. That's a lot of pee.
That's a lot of pee. And like I said, they can just add it to your blood work and urine samples when you go to your doctor every 6 months, a year, whatever.
Well,
So,
the thing about tests like this is that because this isn't a medically necessary panel at this point, you run
ah,
into privacy issues.
okay.
So it's something where people are volunteering to come in and give samples to find out if this is actually an issue for them.
I'm gonna go
So
get my sample in like a minute.
yeah, well, you're just not supposed to sit there and practice your five knuckle shuffle when you give that sample.
Yeah, I know. I know. Contamination of some, yeah. All right. I just thank you because there's these there's headlines that are like freak out, and then I appreciate that. Both of those topics to wrap up on all of that was freak out, and maybe you don't have to. You know what I mean? Like,
Well, but going back to the whole issue of the media once again is that if the freak out is meant to sell eyeballs, I'm not
right,
saying that there isn't a reason to freak out. I'm not saying there is a reason to freak out. It's
right.
it's scientifically it's one of those things that I still consider an unknown.
Hmm.
Now, that doesn't mean that you should throw caution to the wind, or abandon all hope, ye who enter.
Right.
It's one of those things where it's like, there approach everything with skepticism. If you're going to use Roundup at home, maybe take some precautions to cover your skin, wear a mask, wear some goggles to make
Yeah.
sure that you're not getting it into, soft tissue areas. Those are
Mm-hmm.
great. Those are great things that you can do to help protect yourself. Read the label and see what they suggest as a means of reducing your risk of exposure, because it's a chemical. It's exactly what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And the less likely you are to expose yourself, the less likely you are to encounter issues. Now, if
Yep.
you're over there fucking huffing Roundup, that's your own goddamn problem.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things where every piece of this along the way, there is responsibility that has to be taken. The individual user at home has to take the responsibility of making sure they use the product properly, that they're taking the proper precautions in wearing protective gear, that they're spraying at the right times. Don't be out there spraying when it's windy. You need calm days, so that way you're not, it's not that the spray isn't effective when it's windy. They're telling you not to spray when it's windy because you don't want to be getting spray in your fucking eyes. That's, you don't want to have that kind of drift. In farming applications, they tell you not to spray when it's windy because you get chemical drift. And that spray drift will drift onto areas that you aren't necessarily wanting to spray. It's a waste of money. Yeah. So, in the farming side, they got, the farmer has to read the labels. They have to wear the appropriate protective gear. They're the ones that are responsible for mapping out what it is that they need, where they need to spray, how much they need to spray. They're responsible for making sure that they're following the label as directed. And then you get back to the companies. And it's on the companies to make sure that if they need to update what the protective requirements are, that they're doing that.
Yeah.
That if there is a health concern, that they need to be looking into it and addressing it, and involving whoever appropriate to make sure that any health and safety concerns are being addressed properly.
Yeah.
You know,
I love it.
the idea that, I personally struggle with the idea of, hey, this is all fine, but at the same time, I'm also not panicked by it either. Because,
Okay.
like I said, it's supposed to be inert in 48 hours. And until somebody says otherwise, I'm going to say, yeah, it should probably be inert in 48 hours. But if it's not actually inert, like if you could ground up Cheerios and spread it over your yard and it kills your yard, that's a fucking problem.
Yes.
So,
How would
so
it affect animals though? Like the same thing, right? Like
same,
we're
it would
not
be the
sure
same
yet.
issue.
Okay.
It'd be the same issues. So, like anything else goes, like there are precautions that have to be taken every step along the way.
Yeah.
There are questions that have to be answered always.
Mm-hmm.
And what it boils down to is wear proper equipment, use according to label, and don't be a fucking idiot about it.
Right.
There's a lot of that. And also, if you have health and safety concerns, either A, don't
Yeah.
use it.
If you're at risk, you don't use it.
Yeah, don't use it. Or B, you
Avoid it.
know, you know, if there are places out there that are testing food, and if you feel like you need to further avoid it because maybe you're immunocompromised or any
Mm-hmm.
number of different issues, great, do what you got to do to protect you. In the meantime, I fully expect that there are going to be tests done to figure out if this is affecting people. And that's where, as a scientist, I have to say I don't know. Like, it doesn't look good necessarily to me, but at the same time, the answer is I don't know. You know, it could essentially just be another salt. And, maybe you're the kind of person where, having another salt in your food isn't necessarily a great thing, because
Right.
that's what ends up, a lot of these chemicals break down into salts. And so it might not necessarily be good for you, but might not necessarily be what's causing, the cancers. Or it
Right.
could be. It's hard to say
Cancers.
because
Yeah,
there is
that's the
because
point
there
I
is
wanted
no
to make.
definitive answer.
Monsanto's and Bayer and the EPA, they say it's not a carcinogen, and a carcinogen is something that causes cancer. So,
Correct.
and also I
Which,
wanted to say that Roundup also does not cure COVID. God damn it.
no,
So don't
look,
use
if
it for
you
that.
yeah, if you think it cures COVID, well, I mean, you'll definitely be taking Roundup for the rest of your life,
Yeah.
however short that will be.
And
Ugh.
and we and I, great news, we're gonna have Dan on next week. I don't know what we're gonna talk about, but there's new variants of COVID out there in monkeypox. So I'm excited to
Ooh,
talk to him about
monkeypox.
that. You know what
That's
I
gonna
mean?
be a tough one.
Is it? Well, anyway, there's
Well,
only a few cases, but
there's only a few cases, but the way that it's spreading, unfortunately, is
yeah,
been highly publicized in the media, and I am very
yeah.
concerned about their discussion on the methodology.
Okay,
And I'm looking forward to Dan's perspective on that one.
I'm kind of interested in the perspective of people that are contracting it. They're saying that gay men are contracting it more, and I'm kind of so I want to know
That's what
more about
I'm
this.
concerned about is because they pretty much go the every media source that I have seen talk about it go, it's primarily spread among gay men,
Exactly.
but
Right.
everybody can get it through close contact. Like they're leaving out the
Yeah.
close con, like it concerns me because it's the messaging is very similar to what HIV was back in the day,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
and I don't like that. Like if it is primarily being spread through sex, then you just need to say that because guess what? People have sex, and that's what happen. If that's what the answer
That's
is, that's
right.
what the answer is. Don't just sit down and go, it's just gay men, because guess what? There's probably some bi men out there,
Mm-hmm. And
or
straight people,
there's straight
poly people, and
people, poly
normal
people. There,
people.
it's this isn't. It's the messaging is bad. The messaging is
Yeah.
bad, and I don't like it.
Right. I expected it to be called Michael Pox when it hit the
Oh
USA.
God,
You know what I mean? Like some one of those things. But
yeah.
I do have an interesting question for you. I
Ooh,
don't
I like
this is a
interesting
it's
questions.
kind of hard segue here. Is porn the reason for these people shooting in mass? Are video games the reason that shooters, young men 18 to 21, are killing in mass? And is cannabis, or the final one, women, to blame?
I think everybody just needs to beat it and go to bed.
Yeah, I think so too. Starting with Tucker
Jesus
Carlson and Laura
fucking
Ingraham, because that's where
Christ.
these things come from.
Ugh.
I think porn keeps a kid in his house. It doesn't make him leave. I think cannabis makes a kid stay in his house. It doesn't make him leave. But now Tucker Carlson is saying that it's angry women that are pushing men to this, entitled women
Oh,
that are
fuck
pushing these
off.
kids to this.
No, no, no. All right, once again, for the
Yeah,
people in the back.
because we never discussed Highland Park, did we?
No, we haven't had the chance to discuss
And
Highland
I've
Park.
actually from a suburb that's near there. You know what I mean? So
Okay. Well, well, yeah, Highland Park took place the day after we last talked. So,
yeah, yeah.
all right, let's talk about once again
Porn.
how. Yes, let's talk about.
Okay,
I'd rather talk
awesome.
about porn, but
Well,
uh,
I don't want to lead anybody to go mass shoot somewhere. So maybe we shouldn't talk about porn.
look, the only mass shooting you're doing when you're talking about porn involves jerking it until you blow a
Uh,
load. Um,
right.
so,
Mass shooting. I'll mass shoot all over your face, baby.
God, Jesus fucking Christ.
But now we have a title for the episode. You know, we got to do that
No,
more.
God. Dear FBI handler, I hope you're crying as you're listening to this.
Yeah,
Um, no, so once again, everybody wants someone, something to blame
yeah.
for not being involved in their kids' lives or, any number of different things.
Is it Rob
So
Halford or Ozzy Osbourne? Yeah.
it's in my from the time I was little, I've
hmm
had heavy metal, I've had rap music. I have had violent video games. I've had violence
Yeah.
on TV. I have had violent cartoons. I have had all of these different things be blamed as the reason why kids are doing X.
Yeah.
And you want to know what? Here's my question. Who's letting the kids have this stuff?
Wait, the cannabis, the porn, or the guns?
All of it.
All of
Who
it.
who's letting the kids have access to this stuff?
Oh man, but it's all over the place.
Wait,
It's in
but
public and
you mean
everywhere.
parental involvement has to be a thing?
I tried nothing and I'm all out of options. You have
I
to
mean, that's
fix
pretty
it
much
for
most
me.
parents. That's pretty much parents like this. Well,
Mm,
my kid would never do anything like this. Are you involved in your kid's life? Well, no.
no. Right.
Well, fuck. Surprise or not.
Right.
So there's a great report out there about where some of these mass shooters are living essentially online, and they're spending the time in these forums where essentially like you have all of these things that are quote unquote jokes
Mm-hmm.
that basically they just they live off of this kind of attention. Like in the case of this park, this Highland Park shooter, he was talking to some kid in Germany who was just like, oh, fucking do it, all this other bullshit. Like, so,
Yeah.
and
It's
then
an
on top
echo
of that,
chamber, right?
yeah, there are these echo chambers where people like this are living and spending time on the internet. And it's like
Yeah.
anything else. At a certain point, you're always desensitized to certain things. And if you feel like you're in a marginalized community, there's a mental health aspect to this that absolutely plays into this. And these people think they are marginalized. No women like them. Everybody does X, Y, and Z, this, that, and the other.
Mm-hmm.
Like, don't get me wrong, bullying is absolutely a problem, but at the same time, too, mental health is really an issue here. Like, it doesn't really matter what the weapon is that if somebody decides that they want to kill a bunch of people, they're going to figure out a way to do it.
Oh yeah.
You know, you look at for example, the Zarnev brothers.
But why is this the idea? Why is it so much that Highland Park wait, Highland Park was on what, a Monday?
Yeah, it
Like
was
the
on July
4th of
4th.
July? By Tuesday, we were from 309 mass shootings to 315. Like, why is this the idea? I feel like there's a theory out there and they want to test their theory, but it's a bad theory. It's a ban in
So,
theory. You know what I mean?
so let's talk about mass shootings because this is one of those things that as a gun owner, I have a problem with the way that mass shootings are defined. Because there's a
Or,
technical definition that is being used, and that is any shooting where four or more people are injured slash killed. Okay. So Highland Park is what I would consider a mass shooting.
mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Hell,
One
49 people
person,
injured?
one person going out with a gun, shooting to kill, wound as many people as possible.
Yeah.
Las Vegas, for example, another example of a mass shooting.
Mm-hmm.
Robb Elementary, another example of a mass shooting.
Yeah.
The problem is that inside of all of these numbers is that you have various different numbers that are also, I would say, confounding the variable. So, for example, if two gangs decide to go at it with each other and they shoot at each other, and let's say you got five people with
Right.
five guns and four people get shot and injured or slash killed, that's technically a mass shooting.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not, we don't think of that in the same way as somebody who walked into an elementary school or into a public place or into a
But
grocery
they're in the
store.
same stats.
But it's the same stat. Or let's say that there's a shooting that involves the police. You got somebody who wounded four police officers and then the suspect himself was killed. Technically, that's a mass shooting.
Mm-hmm. Which happened in Philadelphia on the 4th of July.
Exactly. That's technically a mass shooting. But you got one person against four cops. Like, I wouldn't necessarily like see where I'm going there. This is like a suicide by cop individual, and he was
Yeah.
maybe it's a mass shooting because maybe his goal was to take out a bunch of cops, but it didn't sound like it. It sounded like it was more of an attempt to be suicide by cop.
Mm.
So you have a number of confounding variables. They use the same thing with gun violence. Look at Montana, for example. Montana, they say, is one of the most concerning states for gun violence. 84% of gun deaths in Montana are suicides. Like, wouldn't consider that gun violence.
I saw the map of mass shootings. It's not in the very center of the United States.
No,
It's
not.
just not in that area. There was no markers there.
No.
They're all around from California, Illinois, Maine, like
Major cities.
Florida, like all, yeah, around, but not
Major cities.
Montana, not like
No.
that.
No, there's not. And what it boils down to is there's a lot of different issues as to why you could sit down and say that. I grew up with guns. You grow up with
Hmm.
them, you grow up with a healthy respect for them. Like, for fuck's sake, I had to have a school assembly one year where the superintendent of the school is like, "Listen, you dumb fucks, you can't be parking on school property with your guns in the gun rack of your pickup." We're like,
Right.
"Who the fuck cares?" Like, okay, where are we supposed to park? Just right across the street, not on school property. So it's like, so you want me to move my truck 10 feet? You know what? Fuck it. Okay. I'll move my truck 10 feet. So hunting season would roll around. All the trucks would be parked literally right across the school. You could literally just walk an extra 2 seconds to your truck.
Yeah.
But the thing is that everybody who grew up around that, like, that wasn't an option. Like, that wasn't a thing that any of us thought about. Like, some of us were hunting on the way into school, most of us were hunting on the way back home. Like, that was
Hmm.
just what it was. you know there were
I have
times where I
an idea
absolutely.
now, though. That's my point.
The thing is that, like anything else, there's a level of involvement that you have to have. There's a level of education that you have to have. I grew up hunting, I grew up around weapons, I grew up with this kind of stuff. Like this, and a lot of us did, and we didn't have these issues in Montana. Why? Because we grew up with it. They weren't taboo. It wasn't this, ooh, I'm gonna go out and act like I'm playing GTA, or
Right.
ooh, I'm gonna, play Call of Duty, but IRL. You grew up with a healthy respect for firearms. And that's not to say that this is a video game issue either. Most of these kids' exposures to firearms are in movies and video games. And
Hmm.
so they haven't grown up around actual firearms. They haven't grown up with parents who know how to use firearms
Right.
or have trained them on how to use firearms. The act of going out and shooting has always been taboo or at least inaccessible. And so if you don't grow up around it and you
Or
don't grow up with
virtual.
that,
Sorry.
yeah, virtual. If you don't grow up around this stuff and you don't grow up with the respect for it, there is an element of, this becomes an option. I hate to say it, but a lot of the times these are kids that are just like first time gun owners.
Yeah.
You
No,
look
I
at
think that's true.
you look at what happened in Uvalde, and the kid literally had just bought two brand new assault rifles. This guy had just purchased one from his dad. Like, that's the problem, is that they're not necessarily growing up around this
It's
stuff.
a kid with a new toy.
Exactly. Or you get, in the case of certain people, like, they just fucking snap, and that happens. But
Well, they
overwhelmingly,
snapped and they finally found something that can help them with that.
or so they think.
They're a broken person that finds a gun in their
But
possession and says, well,
once
use this. But that's the same person that would find an axe in the garage and go, I hate you, mom, right?
but and so then once again you get back to the issue of mental health,
Hmm.
because people who have grown up around this stuff don't see this as an option. It's why Montana's, when it comes to suicide, firearms are the number one issue. And people sit there and talk about gun violence, gun violence, gun violence. They point to Montana. It's like, I wouldn't call suicide gun violence. Like,
Mm-mm.
don't get me wrong, it's a death by a firearm, but it's not, when I think of violence, I think of something that's directed at somebody else.
Oh, agreed. I'm not going to
Having it
judge somebody that goes through suicide. The church has done that in such a way that I just will
right.
never do it.
So then the question is that, is the metric correct? And that's where this gets really tough, because I
Hmm.
actually had a great conversation with somebody about why we don't call mass shooters domestic terrorists. And from a law enforcement perspective, what he said was is that, in terms of legality, it opens up a lot of fucking floodgates that most people don't think about, because now you've got the government's alphabet mafia coming in to investigate essentially the police department, investigate how they're handling all this stuff. They're and you got a bunch of people who are literally getting butthurt. It's like, well, this is my own territory, I can investigate this. But now you have the feds coming in and complicating their own matters in that regard.
Hmm.
And so, like, I understand that. And
I don't
so,
like the surveillance aspect that this allows for. You know what
well,
I mean?
and here's where this gets really fun, is you've got places like New York, as part of their new permitting process, you literally have to hand over the keys to your social media accounts. You have to list them.
Right.
And so,
That's a
but,
shame.
that's a grand question, though. This is kind of one of those things where it's like, this is a real struggle because you have the, is this a good idea? Is this a bad idea? When you're wanting to make sure that you have somebody not getting a gun that shouldn't have a gun, you do want to find out all the avenues that they may or may not be pursuing in order to get a gun, or what influences might be had upon them when they're looking to
Sure.
purchase a firearm. I've had guns since I was like fucking 7 years old. I started my time around guns when I was three, apparently.
7. Who was president when you were 7?
Ray, no, that would have been HW.
Oh, so your parents said, "We'll just have HW raise him from afar," instead of like, no, of course not. And I think that's the problem is people want Joe Biden to babysit their kids with laws when
Well,
they
then
just need to like pay attention to their kids. And I think it's a real issue that they want the government to do things for them and protect them, but then also stay out of their lives and fuck off. You know what I mean?
so for me, like the biggest issue, as I've said multiple times, is that, when it came to studying gun violence, the problem was going to be one of two things. It was either going to be a gun problem or it was going to be a mental health problem. And overwhelmingly, like when you talk to any rational gun owner who has spent years upon years with firearms, they're going to say, yeah, anybody who thinks that they want to take one of these and go kill a bunch of people obviously has mental health issues that need to be addressed. But when you cut mental health funding, when you remove mental health funding, when you villainize mental health, that doesn't lead to people going and saying, look, I think I have a problem that I want to get fixed. They
Mm.
feel like they're a fucking pariah of society, and if they feel like that and society treats them like that, they eventually say, you know what, fuck it, I guess this is what I am. And they
Totally agree.
snap.
I totally agree, but
So you
you're not going to
have,
tell me that if you're not going to regulate yourself, that I'm not going to blame the gun. A well-regulated militia is a militia that regulates well, and that's not being done. One of your members of the
absolutely.
well-regulated militia went on a roof and started shooting people. And if you're not going to regulate yourself, somebody's going to regulate you, and I'm sorry about that, but
Well, and that's
I'm
and
going to
that's the
blame the
real
gun in
answer.
that extent because nobody else is.
Well, and that's where well, and here's the thing is that, there are multiple problems that have happened that have shown this to be the case. You got the kid in Michigan where the parents went out and bought him a gun. You
Yeah.
got the Highland Park shooter who went out and bought who had his dad sign on a gun. You got Uvalde, Texas. Kid literally went out and bought two brand new, what I would consider very bougie guns.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And the problem is that the system failed to regulate, absolutely, but the mental health system also was not present,
Oh,
not
agreed.
nearly available enough. And so
Agreed.
what it has constantly boiled down to, and what I feel like has not necessarily been addressed until potentially recently, with the signing of the new gun laws that got put in, where you've got red flag laws, where you've got money to be put in, money that are
Right.
as being put in place to fund mental health.
There wasn't red flag laws put in, there was incentives to have states do it.
Well, that's one of the bigger issues
Let's give
is
the people that are for gun violence more money and hope they use it in the right way. You know, like that's to me,
it's there's federal funding that's going to be available for states that will put in red flag
mhm.
laws. So basically what
Yeah,
it's saying is, look, if you really truly believe that you want to stop a bad guy from getting a gun, you have to do the things that would stop a bad guy from getting a gun legally. And if you want to put those systems in place, there is money available for you to do it.
right. But if you don't, well, sorry, the residents of Texas are just going to keep getting shot.
Well, and then in that case, that's where unfortunately the residents of Texas are going to have to sit down and say, look, enough's a fucking enough.
I agree.
And
Somebody has to regulate these people. If it's a well-regulated militia and the government isn't allowed to do it, and the citizens aren't allowed to do
yeah,
it,
if the
and the
feds aren't
gun
allowed to do
owners
it, and
aren't
it's
allowed
getting
to do
pushed,
it, and the parents aren't allowed to do it, who the fuck is going to do it? Because I'm
well,
really tired of
the
people
thing is,
dying.
the thing is that
Whose
if the feds
responsibility is
if the
it?
feds aren't allowed to do it, then it becomes incumbent upon the state to do it. And if the
All right.
state's not going to do it, then literally what it boils down to at that point, and this has been argued, and I think it's not necessarily the greatest argument, is that you know people who sell guns, the gun shops, they're the ones that are going to have to sit down and go, I don't feel like you should be getting a gun. I'm not going to sell you the gun. And
I
I think that
agree
that's,
with that. That's what
I
I
think
brought
that
up a
is, I
couple
think that
weeks
is,
ago.
I think that, and I've heard multiple people say that too, and I think that there is absolutely an element to that. But here's the thing: is if one gun shop says, you know what, I think that there's a problem with you buying a gun, there's no place currently for him to go, you know what? If I don't think you should be getting a gun, I should be making sure all these other gun shops know that I don't think you should be getting a gun. And
That's a
that's where
good
these
point.
red flag laws come into play, because now it's a state system, and that state system should interact with a national system that says, hey, look, this person wanted to buy a gun and I have turned them away because I have safety concerns for this individual slash the
Right.
community at large. That has to happen. you know I want people to be able to go out and purchase firearms as they want,
Hmm.
but the thing is that the whole argument of, well, it's never going to stop mass shootings is true, but it can make them a lot harder,
I
in
agree.
that realm,
Yeah. Or it
because
can
now you
just
have to
pause
now
the
you
moment.
well, and here's the thing, 'cause now you have to figure out how are you going to get a gun underground in a day where I would argue that the surveillance state is a lot heavier.
Oh
And
yeah.
so more often than not, these morons are going to run into undercover cops.
Yeah. And I'm fine with that. But it
And I'm
can't
good with that too. But
a
you got to
gun
have the systems in place in order to stop the legal aspect of
but
the
a gun
purchase.
shop owner saying no might stop a shooting, right?
Maybe.
Because that kid is
Absolutely.
having a bad day. And then if his parents recognize if the gun shop owner just says, "Hey, your 18-year-old kid is here to pick up a gun. I know it's legal, but he's showing weird signs," then that can go somewhere. You know what I mean?
That's the problem though, is that if it's an 18-year-old, like legally the parents don't have to be involved. In which case, that's where the red flag law comes
Then we
in.
should
In the
change that.
state, and the state says, you know what? Hey, you know, this guy's in here to buy a gun, and I don't think they should have a gun. State, I need you to step in and take a look at this.
That's fine. That's fine. But
And
parents have to have a role in this somewhere. And
well,
even if that's going to your gun shops and saying, "Hi, I just want you to use discretion, please." You know
well,
what I
and
mean?
that's I think, and that's where this really tough aspect of, you know, we talk a lot about how kids are still kids up until like the age of 25.
Right.
At 18 they're legal, but for example, you can't rent a car until you're 25 or something like that.
Right. But
Or
you
you
can go to
can't buy
war at 18, so why can't you have a gun and smoke at
can't
18? You
can't
know,
buy
that
booze, can't buy smokes at 18, but you can
change
buy it
it.
at 21. So, and realistically, what if the question is that somebody is not mentally formed enough, or whatever your argument is, at 18 and that it's 21, then it sounds like something needs to change.
Something has to change, honestly, and everybody wants to shout at Joe Biden to fix it. Everybody wants to shout at Mitch McConnell for fixing it. And what they're doing is they're walking right past some obvious solutions of community just to complain nationally. And Joe
Oh
Biden
well,
isn't your dad. He's not the police. He's not the boss. He's just a president. And we don't want to give him an outsized role. We don't want to give the president an outsized role in our community. He's there to execute national directives from Congress, right? The people
like
say we want this. Senate says this is how we're going to do it. He gives it to the president. He executes it. I don't want the president coming up willy-nilly with ways to solve problems. I didn't
right.
want it in Trump. I don't want it in Biden. But I want people to understand it's them. You're babysitting your own kid. I'm not.
Right. And there's been some really interesting discussions out there that, some people are going to love, some people are going to hate. Like, for example, you know, you can't buy semi-automatics until you're at least 21 years of age. Like, you could buy pump action, you could buy, single shot, you could buy bolt
Hmm.
action, breakaway, lever action.
Sure.
There's discussions out there in a lot of different realms about, maybe the issue is that,
How many kids does that hurt, by the
we-
way? That are
which
just good kids that wanted to upgrade with their dad, or their family, and now they can't get a gun till 21 just because of the bad apples. But if you're not going to regulate yourself and your friends,
I mean, that's
so
the
many
real
people,
answer.
so many people said, "Yeah, I thought he would be the one that would kill people." Why didn't you say something? Because now you're gonna lose your rights. You know, there
That's
wasn't
and
there
it's
wasn't
always like,
always an age to smoke. You could smoke at any age up to a certain point, and then people were like, "Kids are really abusing this shit. We need to fix this." You know?
right. It's yeah, it's always really tough in that realm
Yeah.
because we everybody, like I said, everybody wants somebody else to fix their problems
Mm-hmm.
often, but they don't necessarily want to admit when they've fallen short in their own. So
Right. I mean, how hard is it when your kid walks in? How was school? Good. Do you own a gun? No. Okay, bye. You know,
right.
if you it's your kid. I'm saying there's different aspects. There's good kids out there that are going to be punished, but we got to do something, and I don't want it to be national and permanent. I'd rather it was local and common sense so that when things went back to normal, we could start going back to normal and
Well,
having good kids upgrade their education.
well, and
This is a problem
where
for
this has
me.
been, and that's where there's a lot of common sense gun owners out there that are like, I
Yeah,
had a conversation with my dad. My dad was like, I don't understand why they don't make everybody go through a background check no matter what. That's should
right.
be common fucking sense. It's like if somebody has been a fucking convict, they
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't be able to just go buy a gun somewhere
Right.
illegally. Like, there's that aspect. For me, it's you can't sit down and talk about stopping a bad guy with a gun if part of the equation doesn't involve stopping the bad guy from getting a gun legally. Like,
Right.
because I mean, realistically, there's always going to be illegal ways to get a gun.
Mm-hmm.
Here in Washington, there's been a lot of busts lately where they're finding stolen firearms. That's
Mm.
what happens. People steal shit. It's also
Yeah.
why you should keep your shit locked up. Number
I
one.
mean, the Prime Minister of Japan got shot by a homemade gun.
And that's the thing is like most people don't realize what it takes to make a homemade firearm isn't really a lot. Like it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to work well enough for the whatever it is that you plan to do. And man,
Right.
I looked at that fucking rigged up
Did
shotgun
you?
that the guy made. Wow. Like that thing, I'm surprised that thing held together, number one. Number two, I'm surprised it didn't blow him up.
Was it a
But number
3D printer?
no, no. I
No.
mean, this thing was literally like fucking pipes and loosey goosey mechanisms
Wow. But he
and
only
fucking
needed to
black
shoot one,
electrical
right?
tape. But that was the thing is like it was the double-barreled homemade shotgun. It literally only needed. And I was having this discussion with somebody else. When you think about firearms, black powder was a pretty primitive process in shooting a bullet.
Mm.
Ram a bunch of powder down, pack it
Yeah.
in there, take a wad, pack it in there, take your
Right.
little ball or, your shot, pack it in there, have a flame on the outside. It used to be that, you had to shoulder this thing and then you had like an actual handheld thing that you would then touch off to the powder chamber to cause that to explode.
Right.
Like black powder is still, readily available and people go black
Mm-hmm.
powder hunting all the time. It's still a very lethal option. You can still make a homemade gun with black powder. It's real easy. Like
Right.
because the thing is that you're not looking for accuracy, you're looking for a projectile to leave at a high velocity.
Yeah.
And so like making a homemade gun is an issue. Like it's actually very simple to do. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not going to go to my local hardware store and buy a fucking pipe because guess what? I don't know what the tensile strength of that pipe is and last thing I need is that thing fucking grenading on me because I don't know what the fuck
Right.
I'm doing. Like realistically, I'm surprised that the homemade gun that guy made in Japan didn't fucking grenade on him. Like I
Yeah.
really sat there and I was like, "Holy shit, that thing looks like it should have blown up on him." But it didn't.
Right.
And that's the thing is that most of the people that, bubba some of this shit,
Mm-hmm.
like it is absolutely fucking wild that it even works to begin with.
Yeah. I mean,
Like I highly doubt like in a place like Japan that this dude had any time to take this thing out and test it to see if it worked.
right, because they only have like 3 shootings a year.
So the idea that this
One.
thing even had yeah, so the idea that this dude literally took
Yeah.
this thing out to even test it is wild to me.
Yeah.
Like I don't even think that happened. So I'm like I said, I am honestly surprised this thing didn't grenade on him and kill him.
Yeah. But I think
And and that's
Congress. Congress has a certain role, Senate has a certain role, and Joe Biden has a certain role. We have to stop yelling at Joe Biden about this stuff. And we have to stop yelling at Donald Trump or whoever the next or whoever the other party is when they're in charge. We
Right.
gotta start doing as much as we can for ourselves. And like the community in Montana isn't the same as the community in Orlando or in Dallas and or in
Right.
Colorado. And I think that there's a difference. Like
Right.
when COVID got bad, we went to masking in areas. Not everywhere, right? Not
Right.
but where in the hot spots. If there's gun violence, we need to protect ourselves in the hot spots.
Right.
And we need to react to it in that way, not nationally. Joe Biden, he's dealing with Ukraine. Does he care about gun violence? Yes. But do we need him to tell us, to guilt us, to fucking come out and just fucking patronize us? No, he can't do anything. And if he tells you he can, he's lying. He
And
covered ghost guns, but wouldn't you have rather that the fucking House and Senate covered ghost guns instead of the president with an executive order that can be removed? You know?
yeah.
Stop
And
asking
that's
Biden.
and that's the thing is that, enough people made enough noise that you actually had enough Republicans sign on to, take on gun violence for the first time in
Kind
30
of.
years.
Kind
I
of.
mean, but that's the thing though, is that as divided as the Senate is, they managed to get what, 64, 65 votes on this?
Yeah. And I admire John Corcoran from he's a
Cornyn?
senator from Texas.
Yep.
And yeah, Corin. Corin? Anyway,
Cornyn.
because when Biden went there, he met with him. He shook his hand and he was gracious. And I was like, I like him. And he's been on the fringe of radical, but he's more sane than not. He's still a fucking super conservative that I don't agree with, but if you're going to be respectful, then I can get on board with you. I
Well,
don't
and
like Ted
that's
Cruz because he's a douchebag and disrespectful, you know?
he is. And that's the thing is that, this was the best of the both worlds that the Democrats were going to get,
It was
was
a good
that they were.
starting point.
And that's the thing is that what it has encouraged is what I hope. Florida actually has a fairly decent red flag law, and
Hmm.
my hope is
Yeah,
that conservative states will take that into account and start to implement stuff like that. I hope that liberal states will take something like Florida's red flag law and implement something like that.
yeah.
Because realistically speaking, like what I want places to make it hard to legally get a gun in certain aspects.
Me too.
Like if somebody has been investigated, convicted of DV, I don't want them having a gun.
Agreed.
Don't. If somebody has, been convicted of violent crimes, I don't want them having a gun.
Hmm.
Until your constitutional rights are restored and you've shown that you've paid your debt to society, like you have to. I don't want certain people having access to firearms, and that's illegal access to firearms, any access to firearms realistically. But
I like Highland Park's ban locally because they say you can't have that. You can't just carry a long gun around here. Like, but you can't say that in Montana, like you said. Like,
no.
and I said that in Dallas. Like, you don't need to carry a long gun in like an urban setting. Like, and I don't, people are like, you can kill people with that, with a long gun or a short gun. Yes, I know. But if you eliminate the ability to carry it in heavy populated areas, you're going to reduce the deaths,
and that's
obviously, you
and
know?
here's I mean, the realistic part about carrying any type of gun, whether it's a pistol or a long gun, is about knowing the application of the gun. If you have a long gun, those are meant for reaching out distances. The bullets,
Hmm.
they, depending on the what you're using, they're meant to go through multiple targets.
Right.
And that's the thing. If pistols, that's not necessarily the
Is an
case.
AR-15 considered a long gun?
It is considered a long
Yeah,
gun.
see, I
Anything
don't.
with a barrel longer than 16 inches is considered a long gun.
Okay, then my point stands. You just don't need it. You don't need to like you can't go into a bar in Dallas with your AR-15, obviously, right?
Right.
You can't go into Chicago and walk around with an AR-15. You can't go to Washington D.C. and walk around with an AR-15. Like if we could just say, no, you can still conceal carry, but like
Well, it goes back to one of the four rules of firearms: know your target and beyond. And the thing about knowing your target and beyond is knowing what your projectile is capable of. And
Hmm.
so with a long gun, I don't have a reasonable expectation, let's say even in my own house, if there was an intruder, that if
Right,
I fired a shot with, my AR, that it's not going to go through a wall. It absolutely will. And I don't know what is beyond that wall. Like
right.
I could have a dog in there, I could have another person in there.
Could be Breonna Taylor. Yeah.
I don't know if it'll go through the wall in my neighbor's house.
Hmm.
But with a pistol cartridge, it doesn't have nearly as much energy. It doesn't go nearly as far. I have a reasonable expectation that yes, it might punch through a wall, but it's going to lose a significant amount of velocity due to the amount of energy that that cartridge has. And that's the thing.
Yeah.
In open spaces, I fully expect that, if I'm in a
Yes.
short, if it's a short engagement pistol, long engagement rifle, but in closed spaces, it doesn't make any sense because number one, I mean, you've got the mechanics of taking whatever your rifle
Hmm.
is and moving it around in a short space. Pistols are far more easily adaptable to short spaces. But number two, like even if, you're looking for rooftop shooters, the idea that you're going to be carrying around an AR to react to that situation is number one. I mean,
Right.
it's
There
I
it
mean,
is.
I would have said that it was impossible, but that's obviously not true.
A good
But
guy with a gun wants the right tool for the job,
and that's the
right?
answer. The right tool for the job changes based on what the threat is.
Yeah.
The thing is that most people don't just carry around their toolbox. You carry around the tool that you're most likely to use, and if
Hmm.
you need a different tool, you have those available to you.
That's my point. Yeah, by situation, right? If you're going
Exactly.
to Walmart and you're worried that there might be a shooter and you want to be the good guy with a gun, you don't bring your AR-15. Right?
You're more likely going to end up shooting through aisles, and you're more likely going to
Right.
shoot somebody. And
Right.
and
So,
that actually came up in a police shooting last year, I believe, where somebody had a gun in a Target
yeah,
or something like that, and the
that's how
cops
Breonna
came in.
Taylor died.
The cops came in with their ARs, and they shot the suspect, but the
Yeah.
bullets went through and also killed like a girl that was in a dressing room.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it's just that whole know your target and beyond.
Hmm.
And the problem with the and beyond is something that doesn't necessarily get thought about as much as it should be.
Yeah.
The and beyond is, like for example, all of those kids that were in Uvalde, in
Hmm.
that room, realistically, and then this is something that I think they've come out and said is that there were enough pistols there that they could have taken out the suspect.
They could have. Yeah.
But waiting for rifles, like you legitimately, like for a period of time, didn't know what was beyond that wall. That could have been more kids.
Yeah.
So not exactly a brilliant strategy.
No, no, Uvalde was not brilliant, and
Well, and
I
and
feel
and
for
that
those
is
people.
well, and you've got the Department of Public Safety down there that are just hammering on the police department, the police chief, who, said who's now saying that he wasn't the scene commander and all this other stuff.
Right.
Like that was the classic definition of a clusterfuck.
Right. I gotcha. It just I want people to understand that carrying an AR-15 down Fifth Avenue should be a weird look. It just should be, right? It shouldn't be normalized.
Well,
But I
for
don't want
me,
to take away from a gun owner that has a pistol on its side concealed carry because that's also fine too. And also, if you're going hunting, you know what looks really weird? Pulling out your fucking Glock 9mm to shoot a deer. It just does.
well, I mean, it might look weird, but as somebody who's had to carry a sidearm for,
To
not
finish it
just
off, right?
finished up, or you run into things like badgers or
Right.
snakes or whatever
Right,
have
but
you
you're not sitting in a blind with a fucking 9mm waiting for a deer to come by.
with a
If you
fucking
if
pistol.
if you saw a guy doing that, you'd be like, you're an amateur and you're gonna hurt somebody. Same thing in the city. If you're carrying a gun that shoots deer and you're walking around, you think to yourself, are you hunting? Like
It's a
we
weird, yeah, I get it. It's a weird look,
it's a
and I
weird
mean,
look.
it's a weird look, and as somebody who comes from Montana,
Yeah.
where I grew up hunting, it's a weird look. You know, it wasn't uncommon to see somebody sitting having their gun sitting in a gun rack in their truck. That was normal.
Right.
That wasn't weird. Like that was common. Like
Right.
but out here, that probably, if you're in Seattle, that would look weird.
Yeah.
And that's
If
the
I
difference.
if I have an RV and I go to Yellowstone Park, I blend in. But if I have an RV and I'm trying to go on Lower Wacker in Chicago, weird look.
So, it's one of those things where
Yeah,
what I understand why people want to be able to display their firearms. It's just not
mm,
what I was taught. It's
right.
like, you know, you have them for if you need them. Your display of firearms, like we never considered our rifle sitting in our gun rack in our truck as displaying. It
Because
was
everybody
literally like
had them.
everybody had them, and it had a purpose, and that purpose was I'm going hunting after school, and I'm gonna see if I can
Right.
get my deer.
And there wasn't like the cool kids that had the ultra cool guns. It's the gun is
Oh,
the gun. You're all using the
it,
same guns, you
but
know?
some of it, you had some kids that, the cool part was is like they got an expensive scope on their gun, and we're like, oh, you son of a
Right.
bitch, that's a nice scope, or it was never, all of us hunted with fucking bolt actions for the most part, and a couple kids that hunted with
I like that.
semi-automatics.
I
I
love a
I
bolt.
I for the longest time hunted with a fucking lever action.
Yeah, my dad taught me on bow and arrow, so
Right. I had friends that were archery hunters, and they always
uh-huh.
had bows and arrows in the back of their fucking truck.
Shit's fun. But I think
So
we're constantly looking for reason in this, and I think it just comes down to that. Like we made fun of people that jaywalked because they got hurt. We should make fun of people that walk around cities with AR-15s. We should point them out. We should all notice them when they're around, you know?
my argument would be that,
A good
it,
owner, good gun owner isn't going downtown with a fucking AR-15. A dangerous one
no,
is. I'm gonna say that.
I I I would say, a person who understands the
Hmm.
tenets of firearms, know your target and beyond.
Yeah,
That's that that's you're literally carrying, a fucking pipe wrench for something that needs a little crescent wrench.
exactly. Let's say a responsible gun owner wouldn't take an AR-15 to go walking and window shopping in
I
downtown
would I would
Seattle.
argue that that's correct.
Okay.
I would say that from my too. Because
Because you don't want to shoot everybody to defend yourself. You might get mugged,
no,
you might need a gun, but you don't want to kill the people behind the mugger. That makes sense. All right.
absolutely. So
I love you, Jeffrey. Thank you for
love you
being here.
too.
I have one question, and it'll be
Okay.
super short. How's Devi?
Eyes are definitely getting better.
Fuck
It's
yeah.
pretty cool. Able to see pretty far distances. Still improving. Got some readers up short. Uh, but it's really awesome to see how they're able to see a lot further and see clearly. It's cool.
That is cool. All right. Thanks for being here. Enjoy your Sunday.
All right. Bye.
Bye. Thank you for being here, everybody, and listening. Yay.
Yay. All right. I gotta go get my tools out and get ready to finish this floor up.
Oh, yeah, the floor.
Yeah.
Good.
So
Sorry.
close.
Okay. Have fun. Love you.
All
Bye.